We've done a lot of work in this channel on reasons to go to the cloud, how to go to the cloud effectively. I've been asked over time about, well, why wouldn't we necessarily want to go to the cloud, or at least take all of our infrastructure, all of our enterprise to the cloud. So here's 7 reasons sort of not to do it. And I want to emphasize here that the Pareto rule absolutely kicks in. I'm talking about the 20% in this talk, as opposed to the 80%. 80% of the IT work that any enterprise does is probably pretty bread and butter, could pretty much run anywhere. You might need some work to run. You might have to do some modernization. You may want to rethink some assumptions, some technologies, and just generally clean up. But there's this 20% that is just not always a great fit. So we're going to talk about that. Exotic hardware is number one. If you have Oracle Rack, if you have, a refrigerator-sized gizmo that does vector computation, if you're not running on, an AMD, Intel sort of family of chipsets, if you're doing things that require massive parallelism and so you have custom hardware, I'm not saying you couldn't find somebody in the cloud to do that, but you have to ask some questions like, would it work as well? Am I particularly sensitive to latency? And, in general, just, is it worth it? Which is not to say that you couldn't have that scenario, but also have some things in the cloud, which is typically called a hybrid cloud. If you have AS400s, or mainframes, or, CEC Cyber 760s, and you just, you have a lot of that legacy hardware around, some of which is still, pretty state-of-the-art. HP 9000s are great platforms. They do a lot of really good work. But you have scenarios where you have some of those things, again, kind of the acid test. Is it on kind of commodity chipsets? And if the answer is no, then think about what your alternatives could be. For example, if you are a COBOL shop, you can go to the cloud. People like Fujitsu have COBOL.net. They have migration tools. They have, all kinds of great things. But while you're doing that, it's really important that you don't lose your subject matter experts, right? If you go into your shop and you announce that the AS400 stuff is being deprecated and doesn't have a future, the resumes will start flying off your laser printers, right? And you'll lose that subject matter expert that you need. And so you need to be really careful around the messaging, and you may need to make sure that your SMEs have a career path forward and that you're not undervaluing that advice. And in some cases where you have a significant investment in physical things, it may not be cost effective. There may not be a reasonable ROI to switch. But you may be able to start moving workloads off, that makes sense in little increments and leaving the rest. Systems of secrets are really tricky, irrespective of what they're running on. If you have just critical intellectual property, especially in the form of trade secrets, things that don't have patent protection, even if they're copyrighted, right? That hasn't always been sufficient unto the day to protect things. Likewise, the data that's in your ERP and CRM or manufacturing management systems or machine control systems, it may not be a good thing to expose to the world. There's a good reason why, for example, biotech and big pharma and other folks run their own private networks with no connections to the outside, because they don't want to expose some of these systems, even run the risk of potentially exposing some of these systems to the cold, cruel internet. And so, you really have to ask the question, is this extra money we're spending cold-heartedly on infrastructure and support and potentially specialized gizmos and licensing, is it in aid of something? Are you protecting something that is worth far more than what it's costing you? So that really is worthy of a conversation, and sometimes it gets glossed over, particularly if you have new management at the top. You're acquired, or you acquire someone, and you may or may not put enough time and energy into thinking about secrets. Mojo Boxes. Mojo Boxes is a long-running joke in the IT community. It refers to any system that everyone is afraid to touch, upgrade, or even look in some cases, because the one human who wrote it, she retired in 1989 and moved to Mallorca, and you're never going to hear from her again. If you've got Mojo Boxes in your organization, you have a huge amount of risk, but you may have to spend a substantial amount of money in reverse engineering efforts, and very, very, very careful documentation. One of the rubrics is never move or migrate anything you don't understand, and a surprising number of our customers have Mojo Boxes. There has to be a driver. And probably one of the most responsible drivers is cost. What does it cost to operate the system now? And if the cost of ownership is reasonable, it may not want to move it unless you can be assured of cost savings. But here's the thing. Cost of ownership is often in the eyes of who's doing the measuring. So if it's an internal system and you don't have chargebacks, and it's just part of that cloud of ongoing running expenses, a giant corporate, operating slush fund, you may not actually know what your total cost of ownership and total cost of operation is year on year. You may have a way of rolling up the cost of some of the subcomponents or some of the activities, but you could be leaving out significant human and service costs because they're simply not well associated to the inventory of your IT systems. So one of the things that customers have found out is we've had a perfectly reasonable technical scope. We're going to move this thing to the cloud and or another data center or whatever, but then it turns out that brings to light all of these iceberg costs, below the waterline costs that never were considered or accounted for in the calculation around what the return on investment was going to be for the project. The kind of running joke we always used to have in my old shop was, if you have to ask if something's legal, it's probably not, but you got to ask. So understand that if you have sort of a lot of legacy systems with legacy behavior, you may be grandparented into a waiver or a pass from regulatory organizations or even your own compliance organization. Something that is hair-raising is marked as tolerant because it's just not worth it. But the second you lay hands upon it to do something different, these things will come in, and they may cost a substantial amount of money to remediate or to comply with. and or it may cause you to have to rethink parts of your business model, because it turns out your business model relied on data flows or data processing that are, interesting and certainly might bring your organization to the attention of your shareholders or your regulators or your compliance organization. And, those are things to think about. This is sort of a riff on the secrets thing, but even if you had perfect security, which there's no such thing, it may transpire that your intellectual property is just too valuable to even think about moving. Sometimes the risk with change is a loss of control and or having to include more people into that circle of trust. And sometimes that's just not, in the big scheme of things, however much money it might save or even make, that trade-off is not a comforting one to the people who are at the top echelons of your company and making corporate decisions. And if you have revenue that comes from, essentially proprietary processing, the fewer people who know how it works, probably the better. One being a very bad number, but, 1,000 is probably not a good number either. And there's that old Russian proverb, that two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. So you've got to think about stuff like that. So that's some reasons to not move to the cloud. My name is Stuart. Thank you for your kind attention.